Ark Raiders is packed with hidden details, buried lore, and quiet secrets that most players never notice. And in this video, I've gone through the entire game to find 558 of them, organized by chapter, so you can drift off at any point and always pick up somewhere new. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this video together because Ark Raiders has one of the most underappreciated lore ecosystems in any game right now. A lot of what's in here isn't handed to you. It's tucked into loading screens, environmental details, item descriptions, and throwaway dialogue lines that most people skip past. When I was assembling this, I made a deliberate choice to lead with the world-building Easter eggs before the faction and character ones, because I think the setting itself is the most overlooked piece of this game's puzzle. There's also a whole category of sound design Easter eggs I ended up cutting for time, not because they weren't interesting, but because this video was already going to be 8 hours long. What you're getting here is the stuff I think rewards the most attention. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The World Before the Ark. The first thing worth noticing is that the game never actually tells you what the world looked like before the Ark arrived. Everything you know about the pre-Ark world is assembled from fragments, and that fragmentation feels intentional. Early in the game, there are structures visible in the background of certain outdoor zones that don't match the aesthetic of anything the current factions would build. They're older. The architecture suggests a different era entirely, one that predates the conflict by what could be decades. One of the loading screen texts references something called the Verdant Period, which isn't explained anywhere in the main narrative. The phrase just appears once, as if the writers assumed players would already know what it meant. There's a particular rock formation in one of the northern maps that, when viewed from a specific elevated position, spells out letters. Most players assume it's procedural terrain generation, but the letters are consistent across every session. Several of the abandoned buildings in the early zones contain calendars. The dates on those calendars are never the same. One interpretation is that time tracking became meaningless after the Ark arrived. Another is that different factions maintained different calendars. The color grading in the tutorial area is noticeably warmer than in the rest of the game. Some players believe this is a visual metaphor for memory. Others think it's just a lighting choice, but it's consistent enough to be worth noting. There's a radio in one of the early safe zones that can't be interacted with. If you stand near it long enough, it plays a short static burst that, when slowed down, sounds like a human voice counting backwards from 10. One of the item descriptions for a common piece of scrap mentions that it was once part of a children's playground. The item itself is a twisted piece of metal with no visual indication of that origin. The description is the only clue. In the first outdoor zone, there's a water tower with a mural painted on it. The mural depicts what looks like a city celebration. Every figure in the mural is facing away from the viewer. There's a loading screen tip that reads, "Not everything that fell was an enemy." The tip has no follow-up and no context. It appears randomly, like all the other tips, but it doesn't match any mechanic in the game. The font used for in-world signage is slightly different from the font used for UI elements. The in-world font has a serif style that was common in graphic design roughly 30 years before the game's implied setting. This suggests a society that stopped updating its visual language at some point. One of the earliest enemies you encounter drops an item called a transit pass. Transit passes are for public transportation. There's no public transportation in the game world. The item description doesn't explain what it was used for. If you look at the skybox in the first outdoor zone during the in-game equivalent of late afternoon, there's a faint outline of something large and geometric partially obscured by cloud cover. It doesn't match any known Ark structure. Several NPCs in the early hubs will occasionally look up at the sky mid-conversation. They don't comment on it. The camera doesn't follow their gaze. It's subtle enough that most players never notice. One of the background conversations you can overhear in the first hub mentions a place called Solon. Solon isn't referenced anywhere else in the base game. It sounds like a proper noun, possibly a city or a region. The environmental storytelling in the collapsed highway segment suggests the highway was being repaired when the Ark arrived. The repair equipment is still in place. The workers aren't. There's an audio log tucked behind a collapsed wall in the second zone that doesn't relate to any named character or faction. It's a woman describing what she had for breakfast. It's the most mundane audio log in the game, and it's hidden better than almost anything else. One of the loading screens shows a silhouette of a figure standing in front of something large. The figure is not holding a weapon. The posture suggests they're looking at something with recognition rather than fear. The vegetation in certain zones has clearly been modelled to include pre-Ark plant species that shouldn't have survived in the current environmental conditions. This could be a design oversight. It could also be intentional. There's a bench in one of the outdoor zones that has an engraving on it. The engraving is a dedication, the kind you'd find on a memorial bench in a park. The name on the dedication doesn't match any character in the game. One of the first boss-tier enemies you encounter has a movement pattern that, from above, traces the same shape as the rock formation mentioned earlier in this chapter. Several of the destroyed vehicles in the early zones have their fuel gauges still visible through shattered windshields. Every single one is on empty. Whether this means people were fleeing and ran out of fuel, or whether something drained the fuel, is never explained. There's a texture on one of the walls in the second zone that looks like a map. It's too degraded to read clearly, but the coastline shape suggests it might be depicting a real-world location. One of the ambient sound effects in the first outdoor zone, specifically the wind, occasionally drops in pitch. When it does, it briefly sounds like a human exhale. The game's color palette shifts noticeably when you enter areas where the Ark's influence is strongest. Warm tones are replaced by a cooler spectrum. This is a common enough design choice, but in Ark Raiders, it's more gradual than in most games. An item called Old Currency appears in a handful of loot containers in the early zones. The currency isn't identified by nation or denomination. It's just currency. The item description says only, "It had value once." There's a poster in the second zone that advertises an event. The event is described as a community gathering. The date on the poster is illegible, but the design style is consistent with the mid-century aesthetic seen in the in-world signage. One of the fallen structures in the highway segment is a pedestrian bridge. The bridge has a plaque on it. The plaque is partially obscured by debris, but reads something close to, "In memory of those who built." Always contains the same 3 items regardless of loot table randomization. This is either a bug or a deliberate decision to ensure certain items are always findable in the early game. There's a child's drawing pinned to a wall in one of the early interior spaces. The drawing depicts the sky, but the sky in the drawing is orange, not blue. It was presumably drawn after the Ark arrived. One of the ambient NPCs in the first hub will, if you stand near them long enough, without initiating dialogue, hum a short melody. The melody isn't from the game's soundtrack. It hasn't been identified. In the second outdoor zone, there's a sign pointing towards something called the Eastern Relay. There's no Eastern Relay anywhere in the accessible game world. The sign is intact and clearly placed deliberately. One of the item descriptions for a medical supply references a manufacturer. The manufacturer's name is a combination of 2 words that in a specific regional language spoken in parts of southern Europe translates roughly to last resort. The texture detail on broken glass in the early zones is unusually high compared to surrounding assets. This level of detail on something so destructible and commonly overlooked suggests someone put significant effort into making it look right. There's a graffito on the underside of the collapsed overpass that's only visible if you crouch and move to a specific position. It reads, "They come back different." One of the background sky elements in the first zone, visible only during the in-game dawn lighting, looks like a contrail. A single contrail heading north. An audio log found in the collapsed highway section is narrated by someone who identifies themselves only by a number. The log describes a routine inspection of something that the narrator is clearly afraid of, though they never say so directly. The first time you reach a high enough elevation point in the early zones to see multiple structures at once, The positioning of those structures suggests they were built around a central point. That central point is now empty. There's a piece of furniture in the second interior space that's bolted to the floor. All the other furniture in the same room is scattered or overturned. Whatever secured that piece of furniture to the floor it held. One of the loading screen backgrounds shows a landscape without any visible damage. It's the only loading screen that doesn't depict some form of destruction. It appears less frequently than the others. An NPC in the first hub mentions offhandedly that the stars look wrong at night. No other NPC ever references the stars. There's no night cycle in the game. Several structural beams in the early zones have been marked with colored spray paint. The color coding appears to be systematic. No documentation exists in the game to explain the system. One of the crates in the second zone has a shipping label on it. The shipping label includes a barcode. The barcode, if scanned with an actual barcode reader, returns a result. Players have debated what that result means. The collapsed ceiling in one section of the first interior zone has let in enough light to allow a single patch of moss to grow. The moss is modelled in detail. It is the only living plant in any interior space in the early game. There's a specific audio trigger in the first outdoor zone that plays a very faint sound when you cross a certain invisible boundary. The sound is consistent with the acoustic properties of a very large enclosed space, like an enormous hall or a cathedral. You are standing in open air when you hear it. A photograph found in one of the early loot containers shows 4 people standing in front of a building. 3 of them are looking at the camera. The 4th is looking at something outside the frame. The game's tutorial text never uses the word enemy. It uses threat and hazard and incoming. The word enemy doesn't appear in any official game text until the first faction briefing. The very first piece of loot the game guarantees you will find is a broken compass. The compass doesn't work. It's not used in any crafting recipe. It has no function. The item description reads, "Some directions are no longer reliable." Chapter 2. Arc Architecture and Signal Tracers. The design language of arc structures isn't random. There's a visual grammar to them. And once you start seeing it, you notice it everywhere. Every arc structure has at least one surface that appears to be a receiver of some kind. The receiver surface is always faced toward the largest concentration of arc activity in the zone. In zones with multiple structures, this creates a network of faces, all looking inward toward a center. The material that arc structures are made of doesn't match any known industrial or natural material in the game world. Item descriptions for arc fragments refer to it only as substrate. The word substrate in engineering typically refers to a base layer that something else grows on or is applied to. One of the arc structures in the mid-game zones has a doorway. Doorways imply passage. Nothing in the game world has ever been documented passing through it. The geometry of arc structures, when reduced to wireframe and viewed from directly above, consistently produces shapes that correspond to organic cellular structures, specifically shapes consistent with neurons. There's a specific sound that arc structures emit when no other ambient sound is present. It sits at a frequency that most audio equipment doesn't reproduce well. When reproduced at higher quality, it sounds rhythmic. Several arc fragments found in the early zones have a grain pattern in the substrate that, under close inspection, resolves into something that looks like writing. No one has translated it. In one of the mid-game zones, there's an arc structure that appears to be incomplete. The incomplete section faces west. All other structures in the same zone are complete. The scale of arc structures relative to the human figures in the game doesn't remain constant. Structures that appear a certain size from a distance are measurably larger when you reach them. This isn't a trick of perspective. The structures appear to be scaled to something other than human proportion. One of the item descriptions for a crafting material obtained from arc structures mentions that the material retains heat indefinitely. Heat requires an energy source. The structures have no visible power supply. There's a cluster of arc structures in the northern part of one map that are arranged in a pattern that doesn't match any other cluster in the game. The pattern looks like a calendar. Specifically, it looks like a lunar calendar. The sound that arc structures make, when first approached, is different from the sound they make when you've been standing near them for several minutes. The initial sound is singular. The longer sound is layered, as if additional sources are joining in. A piece of in-game graffiti near a cluster of arc structures reads, "They're counting something." The graffiti appears to have been made recently relative to the game's timeline. One of the loading screen illustrations shows an arc structure next to a human silhouette for scale. The human silhouette in the illustration is not drawn to match any playable character model. It's a different body type, larger than any in-game character. The color of arc structures changes with the in-game time of day. During daylight, they appear as a cool, dark material. During the in-game dusk equivalent, they emit a faint warmth from their receiver surfaces. There's an arc structure in the second outdoor zone that appears to be embedded in an existing pre-arc building. The structure didn't destroy the building. It grew into it, or around it, or the two things merged in a way that the game never explains. Item descriptions for arc-derived components often use passive voice. Something was done to the material, but by whom or what is never specified. The passive voice feels deliberate. One of the smaller arc fragments, when placed in your inventory next to a compass item, causes the compass to spin. This interaction isn't documented anywhere. The compass still doesn't work. There's a specific visual effect that plays on arc structures during thunderstorms in the game. The structures don't react to lightning. The lightning reacts to them. Several of the arc structures have what appears to be wear patterns, scuffing or erosion consistent with prolonged contact. The contacts would have to be made by something the approximate size and shape of a human hand. In one of the late game zones, there's a cluster of arc structures that are clearly older than the others. The substrate has a different texture. The receiver surfaces are oriented differently, and they don't make the same sound. One of the audio logs found near an arc cluster references a team that went to study the structures and didn't come back. The log is from the team leader. They're describing the structures with what sounds like admiration. There are loading screens that show arc structures in stages of construction or growth. The sequence, if assembled in order, shows the structures beginning as small surface anomalies and expanding over time. The ambient light around arc structures has a slight polarization effect. When players have captured footage of this and run it through light analysis software, the polarization pattern is consistent with the surface patterns of the substrate material. One arc structure in a specific zone has a single feature that no other structure has: a window. It's not a gap or a structural absence. It's a window with a sill, and it looks into darkness. There's a consistent 11-second interval between the rhythmic sounds emitted by arc structures, if you measure them carefully. 11 seconds doesn't correspond to anything obvious in physics or music. It does correspond to the approximate length of a specific segment of the game's loading screen background track. An item called resonant chip can be found inside some arc fragments when broken down for crafting materials. The resonant chip has no crafting use. Its item description says it vibrates slightly when held. The vibration has never been reproduced by any haptic system outside the game. The largest arc structure in the game, located in a late game zone, casts no shadow. All other arc structures cast shadows appropriate to their geometry. This one doesn't. When two players stand on opposite sides of an arc structure and speak to each other through in-game voice, their voices arrive at each side with no delay. The normal propagation delay in the game's audio engine is measurable. This structure removes it. One of the arc structures appears to be growing. The geometry changes between game sessions. It's slow and subtle, but over dozens of sessions the change is measurable. Several arc structures have been damaged, either by player activity or environmental factors. When damaged, they don't splinter or crack the way the substrate material behaves elsewhere. They shed the damage like a layer of skin, regenerating within a single session. There's a faction briefing in the mid-game that mentions arc structures responding to vocal tone, specifically to distress. The briefing doesn't explain how this was determined or by whom. An arc fragment found in the first zone looks, on close inspection, like it contains something inside it. The object inside is too small and too blurred to identify clearly. It is not a defect in the texture. It is modeled as a distinct enclosed object. The way arc structures handle acoustics is inconsistent with their geometry. They should produce echo. They produce something closer to absorption. Sound goes near them and doesn't return. One of the developer's maps, partially visible on a loading screen, labels an area near an arc cluster as a quiet zone. This label doesn't appear in the game's HUD or navigational system. In the game's files, arc structures are grouped under an asset category that has been named differently from all other structure categories. The other categories use descriptive names. This category uses a word that, in the context of the game's setting, means something closer to guessed. A specific arc structure in one of the mid-game zones produces a bioluminescent glow during rain. Bioluminescence is a biological process. Arc structures are not biological, or at least nothing in the game confirms they are. There's an item called an arc impression, which is a cast made from the surface texture of a structure. The item description says the impression felt warm when it was made and has been cold ever since. One of the background factions references attempting to communicate with the structures using electromagnetic signals. They report that the structures responded. The faction notes don't specify what the response was. In the game's late stages, arc structures begin appearing inside previously cleared interior zones. They weren't there before. No cutscene or narrative beat explains their arrival. Two arc structures in the same zone appear to be oriented toward each other. Not toward the center of the cluster, not toward the arc concentration point, but toward each other specifically. The angle of their receiver surfaces is precise. An audio trigger in the largest arc cluster plays a sound that has been analyzed by players and identified as consistent with a human heartbeat, slowed to approximately 1 beat per 12 seconds. One of the item descriptions for a mid-game crafting component references arc structures in past tense, as if they no longer exist in the form being described. The structures clearly still exist. The description was written as if from a point in the future. There's a section of wall in the third outdoor zone that has arc substrate growing across it in a pattern. The pattern, when isolated and scaled, matches the shape of one of the constellations visible in the game's skybox. A note found near an arc cluster reads, "It isn't building, it's remembering." The handwriting is not identified as belonging to any named character. The arc structures in the snow-covered zones have no snow accumulation on them. Every other surface in those zones accumulates snow dynamically. The substrate repels it. One of the ambient sounds in arc-heavy zones is the sound of pages turning. Very slowly, very faintly. But it's there. There's an arc structure positioned directly in front of a pre-arc monument. The monument is commemorative. The arc structure doesn't obscure it. The receiver surface of the structure faces the monument directly. An item obtained from a late-game arc structure is called a residual. Its description reads, "Something was here." This is what stayed. The final arc structure encountered in the linear progression of the game is smaller than all the others. It's easy to miss, but it's the only one that doesn't make any sound at all. Chapter 3. Faction Signals and Buried Histories. The factions in Arc Raiders are not what they appear on the surface, and the game gives you more than enough material to piece together who they actually are, if you're willing to look. The faction briefings you receive early in the game are written in a very specific tone. They're informative and controlled. They don't use emotional language. But the audio delivery of those briefings includes a slight audio compression effect that suggests they were originally recorded in a confined space, not a studio. One of the faction insignias, when viewed in a mirror or reversed, contains an element that doesn't appear in the standard orientation version. This isn't visible in the HUD. It's only visible on in-world objects that display the insignia. Several faction-specific dialogue lines reference events that the player character is implied to have no knowledge of. The characters delivering these lines don't seem surprised by this gap. They seem resigned to it. There's a faction-affiliated building in the second zone that has two entrances. One is marked clearly, the other is unmarked and positioned so that it's only visible from a specific approach angle. Both lead to the same interior. An audio log attributed to a faction leader references a decision that the same leader, in a later log, appears to have no memory of. Either the logs are from different people using the same title, or something happened between the two recordings. One of the factions uses a call sign system. The call signs are words from a language that predates the Ark arrival by what the linguistic context implies to be several centuries. There's a piece of environmental storytelling in a faction-occupied building where every chair around a meeting table faces the same direction. Toward a window. The window faces an Ark cluster. A faction-specific crafting recipe includes an ingredient that, according to its item description, no longer exists in the game world. The recipe still works. The ingredient can still be found. This either means the item description is wrong, or time works differently in certain parts of the game world. Several faction soldiers in the mid-game zones will stand attention near Ark structures during certain in-game weather conditions. They don't do this during combat. They don't do it when players are watching directly. The behavior appears in peripheral vision. One faction symbol includes a gear, a wave, and a star. The official faction lore doesn't explain the symbolism, but these three elements correspond to three distinct phases described in an early game audio log that doesn't identify its faction of origin. There's a faction outpost in the third zone that has been abandoned for what looks like weeks. The food on the table is still warm, not as a game mechanic, but as a note in the environmental detail, a small piece of steam particle effect still rising from a bowl. An item obtained from a faction cache is labelled as a negotiation record. The record is blank, entirely blank. The item has no further description. One of the factions has a secondary headquarters that's never referenced in any of their official dialogue or briefings. It's only identifiable by the presence of their insignia on a wall in what appears to be a completely unaffiliated building. A specific faction NPC who appears in three separate zones says slightly different things in each zone. In the first zone, they're confident. In the second, they're careful. In the third, they don't complete their sentences. There's a faction-specific weapon modification that changes the sound of the weapon when fired. The altered sound is quieter than the standard, but more notable is what the altered sound resembles. It's close to the sound that Ark structures emit at their base frequency. One faction's safe house contains a corkboard with documents pinned to it. Most of the documents are illegible. One isn't. It's a list of names. None of the names belong to in-game characters. An overheard conversation between two faction members in the second zone touches on something they call the First Contact Protocol. The protocol isn't explained. One of them says they hope it never has to be used. There's a building in the mid-game that has faction markings from two different and ostensibly opposing factions on the same wall. The markings are the same age. They were made at the same time. One of the factions distributes a newsletter in the game world. Copies can be found in various locations. The newsletter is 4 issues long. Issue 3 is missing from every location it would logically appear. It doesn't appear anywhere in the accessible game. A faction soldier found dead in the third zone has equipment from a different faction. Not all of it, just one piece, hidden under their outer layer. There's an audio log in which a faction member describes being watched by something inside an Ark structure. They describe it as making eye contact. They don't elaborate on what they mean by this. One faction's lore references a group they call the Firsts. The Firsts are described with deference bordering on reverence. No other faction acknowledges the Firsts exist. A faction terminal in the second zone has a login screen. The terminal isn't interactive, but the name visible on the login screen doesn't match any faction member's name referenced in the game's lore. There's a room in one of the faction headquarters buildings that is locked. The room is labelled storage. Other storage rooms in the same building are unlocked. The locked room has light coming from under the door. Several faction banners in the late game zones have been defaced. The defacement isn't random graffiti. It's targeted. Specific elements of the insignia have been covered or altered. One of the factions has a rank system referenced obliquely in several audio logs. The highest rank is mentioned once. The title for that rank is a word that translates, in the archaic language used for their call signs, to something close to the one who knows the shape of the end. A faction vehicle found abandoned in the second zone has a navigation system still running. The destination displayed is a set of coordinates. Those coordinates don't correspond to any accessible location in the current game. There's a faction-specific loading screen tip that advises players to avoid the northern approach to a specific landmark. No other loading screen tip references a specific directional approach. The northern approach in question leads directly to an arc cluster. An item found in faction territory is called a loyalty token. The item description says the token was issued voluntarily. The word voluntarily is italicized. One faction's audio logs are all recorded by the same voice, except one. One log, buried in the third zone, is narrated by a different voice entirely, using the same faction's terminology, but with an accent that doesn't match any regional dialect established in the rest of the game. There's a faction NPC who will occasionally speak to a player, and then, mid-sentence, appear to forget what they were saying. They apologize. They don't finish the thought. This happens exactly 3 times with this NPC, and only ever on the third encounter with them. A wall-mounted map in a faction headquarters shows territorial boundaries. The boundaries don't match the accessible game world. There's a large section of the map marked simply as under discussion. One of the factions has a symbol painted on specific rocks throughout the game world. These painted rocks form a trail. The trail leads to a location that, when reached, is completely empty. No enemies, no loot, no NPCs, just a cleared space. There's an in-game book found in a faction library. The book is titled, with a proper noun. The proper noun matches the name of the woman who narrated the mundane breakfast audio log from Chapter 1, a faction-specific dialogue line, delivered by a minor character who appears only once, is the only line in the game where someone directly says they don't believe the official account of what happened. They say it quickly, in passing, and don't repeat it. One faction's recruitment posters are present throughout the early game. In the mid-game, they begin to appear defaced. In the late game, they're gone entirely, replaced by blank walls with the outline of where they used to be. There's an audio trigger in one of the faction headquarters that plays a snatch of music when you walk past a specific terminal. The music is from a genre that suggests it predates the Ark arrival by at least a generation. A faction soldier in the third zone carries a photograph. You can't take the photograph. You can see it when the soldier moves in certain ways. The photograph appears to show an arc structure that doesn't match any structure in the game. One faction's briefing materials include a line about an extraction that went wrong. The extraction isn't named. The date is redacted. The number of personnel involved is listed as more than can fit in any faction vehicle shown in the game. There's a piece of equipment in a faction armory that has been tagged out of service. The tag says the equipment was flagged following an incident. The incident is referenced by a case number. No document with that case number exists in the accessible game. An NPC affiliated with one faction will, when asked about the Ark, say, "We've been asked not to discuss that." This NPC is the only character in the game to reference having been asked to stay silent. One of the factions has a memorial wall. Names are carved into it. The memorial lists a specific date as the day of loss. That date is in the future relative to the timeline the game establishes. A faction guard post in the mid-game has 2 guards on every visit. One guard is awake and one is sleeping. No matter when you visit, the same guard is always sleeping. Same posture, same position. They never rotate. There's a faction-specific item called a chain of custody form. The item description says the chain of custody has been interrupted. It offers no further context. A faction's communication channel, audible on certain in-game radios, broadcasts on a loop. The loop includes a short gap, approximately 3 seconds, where the broadcast stops entirely. During that gap, something else is briefly audible before the loop resumes. One faction building has a welcome mat at the entrance. The welcome mat is the only domestic detail in the entire building. Everything else is utilitarian. The mat is clean. There's a faction-specific mission briefing that refers to a previous operation. The previous operation is named. The name matches an event referenced in an audio log from a completely different faction, but described from an opposing perspective. An NPC who provides faction-related side objectives after all side objectives are completed, stand in their designated location and do nothing. They don't acknowledge the completion. They don't have a final dialogue line. They just stand there. One faction's internal documents use a dating system that's different from the standard in-game calendar. The difference implies their organization predates the in-game timeline by approximately 40 years. A faction terminal in the final zone of the game, accessible after a series of events, displays a single line of text when interacted with. The text reads, "We knew you'd come back." The terminal doesn't specify who "we" refers to, or who "you" is. Chapter 4. Character Traces and Personal Artifacts. The named characters in Arc Raiders don't always say the most interesting things in their dialogue. The most interesting things about them are what they leave behind. There's a personal item left in an early game location that belongs to a named character. The item itself is unremarkable, but the way it's positioned suggests it was placed deliberately, not dropped. One named character has slightly different facial detail depending on which zone you encounter them in. The differences are subtle but consistent. More wear in later zones, less in earlier ones. The zones aren't necessarily encountered in that order. The model remembers something the narrative doesn't. An audio log attributed to a character the player works closely with contradicts something they say in direct dialogue. The log predates the dialogue. Either they change their mind, or they're managing what information they share. There's a photograph found in a mid-game location that shows a group of people. One of the named characters is in the photograph, but is partially obscured. You wouldn't know it's them unless you recognize a specific piece of equipment they carry in-game. One character's equipment set includes an item that serves no mechanical function. The item is a small token, described only as a keepsake. The keepsake's description references a name not used anywhere else in the game. A named character delivers a line of dialogue that ends mid-sentence when interrupted by ambient game sound. If you return to that character and trigger the same dialogue again, the full sentence plays. The second half of the sentence changes the meaning significantly. There's a room in one of the game's interior zones that appears to be a personal space, not a functional room. It has a sleeping area, a desk, and a small collection of objects. None of the objects are labeled as belonging to any character, but one of the objects matches the item description of something a specific character says they lost. One character asks you a question mid-game that no other character asks. The question is, do you think the things you've seen change what you remember from before? The question has no mechanical response options. It goes unanswered. A character's weapon has a name engraved on it that isn't the character's own name. In the game's lore documents, this other name appears once as a casualty in an early game event. There's a character who appears in the background of several in-game areas, but who has no dialogue and no interaction prompt. They're fully modeled. They're always there, they're never acknowledged. One named character has a scar in their early game model that's absent from their late game model. Scars don't disappear. This suggests the late game model represents an earlier point in the character's personal timeline, which would mean the narrative isn't entirely linear. An item associated with a named character has an item description written in first person. All other item descriptions in the game are written in third person. This one says, "I made this because," and then stops. The sentence is incomplete. There's a moment in one of the mid-game narrative sequences where a character's shadow doesn't match their movement. The shadow continues moving for approximately half a second after the character becomes still. One character's idle animation includes a very brief gesture that looks like checking a watch. The character isn't wearing a watch. A personal audio log found in the late game is narrated by a character the player has been working with throughout. In the log, they describe meeting the player character for the first time. The description doesn't match the circumstances of the actual in-game first meeting. There's a character whose dialogue changes significantly if you've completed a specific side objective before meeting them. They reference things you did without being told. The narrative doesn't explain how they know. One of the named characters carries a book in a visible slot in their equipment model. The book changes between sessions. The titles on the spines are too small to read, but the books are distinct from each other. A character, who is described as having died in the game's early events, appears in a crowd scene in the background of a late-game cutscene. They're not identified. Their model is slightly different. They're there. There's a named character whose faction affiliation is never explicitly stated. Everything about them is consistent with one faction's culture and terminology. But the one time another character references their faction, the naming is avoided. One character's backstory, assembled from audio logs and item descriptions, suggests they were present at the event the game uses as its primary historical anchor. They've never mentioned this in dialogue. A named character's personal supply cache discoverable in one zone. The letter isn't fully readable, but the first line and the signature are visible. The name on the signature has appeared once before, on the in-game memorial wall from Chapter 3. There's a character who speaks with an accent that doesn't match any faction's established geographic origin. Background audio logs suggest that accents like this one were once associated with a region that no longer exists in the post-arc geography. One of the playable character customization options includes a scar on the face that matches the scar seen on a named NPC's early game model. The description for the customization option is familiar. A named character pauses before answering every question that involves the word before. The pause is uniform. It's clearly built into the dialogue timing. There's an item obtainable from a character's personal space labeled a draft. The item is a piece of paper. The paper has text on it. The text is a partial speech, written as if for public delivery. It's never given. One character's voice changes pitch, almost imperceptibly, when they lie. This has been verified by players who isolated and compared audio across multiple playthroughs. There's a character who will, in one specific late-game zone, walk to a window and look out for several seconds before any scripted event triggers. The window faces the same direction as the incomplete arc structure mentioned in Chapter 2. A personal journal found in the game doesn't belong to any identified character, but the handwriting matches the handwriting on a note that is explicitly attributed to a named character. The journal describes events that contradict their official account. One character's movement speed in non-combat areas is statistically slower than other NPCs, by exactly the same margin in every zone. It isn't a movement penalty. The character model is carrying something that isn't rendered. There's a named character who is only ever seen indoors. In every zone, every encounter, they're inside. There's no narrative explanation. There's no comment made on this by any other character. An item found in a late-game location is labeled with a character's name and the word EFX underneath it. In certain legal and institutional contexts, the term effects is used to describe the possessions of a deceased person. The character is alive in the game. One character's dialogue uses a specific phrase in 3 separate encounters. The phrase is slightly different each time. On first listen, this seems like a scripting inconsistency. On second listen, the changes in phrasing suggest the character is revising their position on something. There's a background NPC in one of the faction hubs who is always doing paperwork. The paperwork on their desk changes daily. If you look closely, the changing paperwork appears to be tracking the number of times the player character has visited that zone. A named character gives what appears to be exposition dialogue in the mid-game, but the information they provide, checked against other sources in the game world, is incorrect on one specific point. Everything else they say is accurate. That one inaccuracy is specific and targeted. One character's arc, as implied by the audio logs and environmental storytelling, has an ending that's never shown. The game ends before it happens, but the trajectory of the evidence points toward an outcome that would change how you understand their role in the main narrative. There's a minor character encountered only once who makes a reference to having seen the player character before. This is the first time the player character has been to that zone. The minor character doesn't clarify what they mean. An NPC who serves as a vendor has a display case with items that can't be purchased. The items aren't labeled as unavailable, they're simply never acknowledged. If you look at them long enough, one of them is labeled with the name of the woman from the breakfast audio log. 1. Named characters' faction affiliation changes between the first and last time you encounter them, judging by their equipment. Neither they nor anyone around them acknowledges this. There's a character who always faces away from arc structures. In every environment, in every encounter, if an arc structure is in the scene, their model orients away from it, regardless of the narrative reason for their presence. A personal audio log attributed to a senior character includes a moment of ambient sound before they begin speaking. The ambient sound is the same as the sound heard in the largest arc cluster. One character's equipment has a date stamped on it. The date is before the arc arrived. The condition of the equipment is consistent with it having been in continuous use since that date. There's a character who speaks in 2 languages within a single dialogue exchange. The second language appears only in that one line and is used for a phrase that translated says, "Not in front of them." An item that belongs to a named character, found late in the game, has a small inscription on the inside surface. The inscription is the same phrase used on the memorial bench from Chapter 1. One of the characters the player is introduced to as a reliable ally has, somewhere in their personal space, a document that appears to be an evaluation of the player character. The evaluation was written before the player character arrived. There's a character who is described in one audio log as having a distinctive laugh. In no piece of in-game audio does this character laugh. Not once. A named character disappears from their usual location after a specific in-game event. There's no cutscene or acknowledgement of this. Their space remains. Their door is open. Their belongings are still there. One character's model has a slight modification in their right hand, a detail in the texture that suggests the hand was injured and healed imperfectly. In no dialogue or audio log does this character mention this. It's just there. There's a character who will, if you stay in their dialogue loop long enough, begin repeating an earlier line, instead of proceeding to a new one. But the repeated line is delivered with different vocal inflection, as if it means something different now. Chapter 5. Sound Ghosts and Hidden Frequencies. The audio design in Arc Raiders does things that most players never catch, because most players are focused on what's in front of them. This chapter is about what the game is putting in your ears when you think you're hearing nothing. There's a phenomenon that players have documented in the first outdoor zone, where the standard ambient wind sound layer drops out for approximately 4 seconds and is replaced by a different sound. The replacement sound is of people talking, too low to hear distinctly, but the cadence is conversational. Certain weapon types, when fired in a specific sequence and at a specific tempo, produce a harmonic resonance in enclosed spaces that doesn't correspond to any normal acoustic behavior. The resonance pitch is the same as the bass frequency of arc structures. There's an in-game track that plays in one of the faction hubs. If you listen to the full loop, the last 2 seconds before it repeats contain a note that doesn't appear anywhere else in the loop, a note that doesn't belong to the key the track is written in. Several of the ambient sound layers in the outdoor zones contain reversed audio. This has been confirmed by players who have isolated and processed the game's audio files. The reversed content is not music. It's speech. One of the game's environmental areas, a collapsed tunnel in the second zone, produces an echo when the player fires a weapon or makes a loud sound. The echo is delayed by slightly too long for the space's geometry. The delay suggests the echo is bouncing off something much further away than the visible tunnel walls. There's a sound effect that plays when you pick up certain loot items. The standard pickup sound is a short tone. For a small number of items, specifically those with significant lore connections, the pickup sound is a different tone, lower, longer, almost like an acknowledgement. The loading screen music in Arc Raiders is not the same track looped indefinitely. It's a composition with a very long structure that progresses through movements. Most players are on loading screens too briefly to hear more than the opening. Players who have idled on loading screens for extended periods have documented several transitions and at least one passage that sounds like a voice without being identifiable as one. In one of the game's interior zones, there's a room that produces silence. Complete silence, no ambient sound, no background hum, no environmental effects. When you fire a weapon in this room, the gunshot sounds different. Flatter, more real. One of the faction radio broadcasts, heard on in-game equipment, contains a section of code within its audio that, when decoded, produces a sequence of numbers. The numbers correspond to item ID numbers for items that don't exist in the accessible game. There's a sound that plays during a specific weather event in the game. The weather event is uncommon. The sound that plays during it is not documented in any of the game's sound design credits. It has no identifiable origin in the game's audio library. An audio log found in the mid-game zone has a second voice in the background. The main narrator speaks at normal volume. The second voice is quieter and appears to be responding to something other than what the narrator is saying. The game's title screen has a musical motif. This motif appears once in the game world's ambient audio, in a late game zone, in a degraded and slowed form. The degraded version sounds older, like a memory of the original. Certain areas in the third zone produce a directional audio cue that suggests something large is moving somewhere below the accessible map. The cue is directional and consistent. It doesn't belong to any documented enemy or event. There's a sound effect associated with arc structure, proximity. The effect is documented. What's not documented is that the effect has a layer that's inverted. While the audible component rises in pitch as you approach, the inverted layer, not audible through standard speakers, drops. One of the game's NPC characters hums occasionally during idle animations. The hum has been identified by players with musical training as an almost exact replication of a specific piece of classical music. The piece was written more than a century before the game's setting. In the game's storm sequences, the thunder has a consistent quality. But in one specific zone, during one specific storm timing, the thunder contains an additional overtone that several players have described as sounding like a word, the same word, consistently. There's an in-game radio broadcast that exists in the game's files, but does not play in any accessible zone. The broadcast is in a language not used anywhere else in the game. The language has been tentatively identified as one that, in the real world, has been classified as extinct. One of the ambient sound layers in the arc structure zones uses binaural recording techniques. This is unusual because binaural audio loses most of its effect outside of headphones, and Arc Raiders doesn't specifically recommend headphone play, but the binaural layer suggests the audio design for those zones was intended to feel like it was inside the player's head. A specific in-game creature, encountered rarely in the second zone, produces a vocalization on death that sounds like a word in one of the game's established languages. Players have translated it. They've chosen not to publish the translation because they can't agree on whether it's an intentional Easter egg or a coincidence. There's a sound cue that plays once, exactly once, in a mid-game narrative sequence and never plays again. Players who noticed it described it as sounding like a door opening very slowly in a large empty building. It's not tied to any visual event in the sequence. The game's menu navigation sounds use a consistent tonal language, confirming an action, cancelling, navigating, but the sound for confirming a faction choice is different from all other confirmation sounds. It uses a tone associated with arc structure proximity. One of the background tracks in a late game zone has a passage where the music briefly stops and an ambient sound takes over. The ambient sound is of rain, but there's no rain in that zone. There's no rain event triggered. The rain sound plays for 11 seconds and then the music resumes. There's an audio Easter egg that requires 2 players to find. When 2 players stand in specific positions relative to an arc structure, and one of them speaks into in-game voice, the other player hears the voice as if it's coming from the structure, not from the player's position. The in-game footstep sounds change subtly on different surfaces, as expected, but there's one surface, a specific type of arc-adjacent terrain, where the footstep sounds are 1 frame delayed. The delay is small enough that most players don't consciously register it. It creates a subtle sense of disconnection between movement and sound. An ambient track in the faction headquarters buildings has a passage that appears to be encoded. Players who treated it as Morse code, a stretch, found a short string of letters. The letters spell a word that translates, in the language used for faction call signs, to origin. One of the game's loudest events, the sound of an arc structure activating in proximity, has been reverse engineered by players. Underneath all the layers of the activation sound, at the absolute base, is a sound that has been identified as consistent with the acoustic profile of a very specific real-world location. A large underground chamber, several hundred meters below the surface. There's a sound effect that plays when you die in certain zones, but not others. The death sound in arc-heavy zones is longer than in non-arc zones. The extra length when isolated sounds like an intake of breath. One of the in-game instruments heard in faction hub music has been identified by players with expertise in historical instruments as a type that hasn't been manufactured since the mid-20th century. The instrument is present in the game's audio, which is set in a world where that manufacturing tradition would have no reason to have continued. A specific ambient track in the late game contains a field recording. Field recordings are recordings of real-world environments used as audio material. This one contains a sound that multiple players have identified as a specific real-world location, based on its acoustic signature. The location is disputed. There's an audio cue associated with a specific character's dialogue tree that others have identified as a subliminal tonal layer beneath the character's voice. The tone sits at a frequency associated with mild unease. The character is one of the game's most ostensibly trustworthy figures. One of the ambient sound loops in the game has a version that plays when no player has been in a zone for a certain amount of time. The variant includes sounds that aren't present in the standard version. These sounds suggest occupancy. A sound effect attributed to an arc structure event in the early game has been isolated and its frequency analyzed. The frequency profile is consistent with the resonant frequency of human bone, specifically the resonant frequency of the human skull. There's a background track in one zone that, when played backwards, produces a melody. The melody is the same as the one hummed by the NPC from earlier in this chapter. One of the game's loading screens has a sound design element that most players don't notice because they're looking at the visual. Beneath the standard loading music, at very low volume, is a voice reading numbers. The numbers are coordinates. They don't correspond to any accessible game location. An ambient sound in the game's starting area plays only once per session. It's a door closing, somewhere distant. The sound is too quiet and too brief for most players to catch on first pass. There's no door in the starting area that could produce that sound. The audio design for one of the game's environments uses a technique called acoustic modeling, where the sound of a space reflects its real geometry, but in one specific room, the acoustic model used doesn't match the room's actual geometry. The modeled space is larger, taller, much taller. There's a recording hidden in the game's files labeled Used Unused. The recording is 12 seconds of silence, followed by a sound. The sound has not been publicly identified. Players who have encountered it in testing environments have described it as memorable without being able to explain why. One of the game's environmental tracks has a section with a clear time signature change. The rest of the track is in 4/4 time. The section that changes drops to 3/4 briefly, then 3/4 again, then returns. The isolated section, in 3/4, matches the rhythm of a specific speech pattern used by one of the game's named characters. A weapon modification found in the late game changes not just the sound of the weapon, but also the ambient audio in the zone where it's used. The change is subtle. The ambient frequency drops. The zone sounds quieter than it did before, even during combat. Chapter 6: Environmental Echoes and Map Secrets. Every map in Arc Raiders has at least one area that functions differently than it appears to. This chapter covers what those areas are and what they might mean. There's a section of the second outdoor zone that can only be reached by combining two platforming maneuvers that aren't explicitly taught by the game. The area at the top is completely empty. No enemies, no loot. Just a view of the map that isn't available from any standard location. From that height, the map's structural damage forms a legible pattern. One of the game's underground zones has a room that doesn't appear on the level's internal geometry map. Players who have mapped the zone manually have found the room occupies space that should, based on the surrounding geometry, be solid rock. There's a floating object in one outdoor zone that can be seen from the standard play area, but can't be reached through normal navigation. The object appears to be a piece of pre-arc signage. The visible face of the sign says something, but the angle and distance make it illegible from below. In the third outdoor zone, at a specific coordinate, the sky texture changes. It's subtle and brief, but the section of sky visible from that spot shows a star pattern that doesn't match the rest of the game's skybox. The stars in that section are in different positions. One of the game's tunnels has a section where the lighting comes from no identifiable source. There's no light fixture, no open sky above, no bioluminescent material. But the tunnel is fully lit in that section. There's a collapsed building in the mid-game that, when examined from outside, has too many floors. The number of floors visible on the exterior is one more than the number of floors accessible on the interior. A specific crop of terrain in the second zone has different ground surface material than the area around it. The area isn't fenced off, isn't marked, and has no loot or enemies, but the material is noticeably different, darker, more compacted, like something very heavy stood there for a very long time. One of the game's indoor spaces has a staircase that goes down. The staircase isn't blocked. It simply ends at a wall after a standard flight of steps. The wall at the bottom has no texture discontinuities, but the acoustic response in the stairwell behaves as if the space continues downward. There's a door in the third zone that appears in one location during your first visit and in a different location during subsequent visits. The door is in different spots but always accessible, always locked. In one of the outdoor maps there's a tree, one specific tree, in a world with many damaged or dead trees, that is fully grown and fully alive. It has no item prompts, it can't be interacted with, but every faction in the game has a marker within visual range of it. A section of wall in the mid-game has a crack in it. The crack is modelled in detail. If you stand at the crack and look through, you see another room. The room isn't accessible from the current floor. The room has furniture in it. The furniture is arranged as if people were sitting around a table. There's a portion of the second outdoor zone that reliably causes a specific type of enemy to behave differently. The enemy, which is ordinarily aggressive, becomes passive in that portion of the zone. It doesn't become passive anywhere else. The portion corresponds to the same coordinates as the darkened terrain from earlier in this chapter. One of the game's highest accessible elevation points, reachable through a non-obvious path, has an item pinned to the surface at the top. The item is a note. The note says, "So you found it." That's all it says. There's a waterway in the third outdoor zone that moves in two directions simultaneously. The current near the surface moves east. At the visible bottom, it moves west. The game's physics engine doesn't typically support bidirectional currents. A section of the abandoned highway has a section of lane markings that don't match the highway's direction. The markings, for a brief stretch, face perpendicular to the road. They look deliberate. They look like they were painted after everything else. One of the game's underground rooms has a mural on the ceiling. Murals on ceilings require equipment and time to paint. The mural depicts an arc structure. The date that would have to be assigned to its creation, based on context clues, predates the arc's arrival in the game's established timeline. There's a location in the first outdoor zone that produces a visual distortion effect, similar to heat haze, even in cold weather conditions. The effect is persistent and localized. It's centered over a specific patch of ground. Nothing is buried there. The ground is solid, but the distortion doesn't stop. One of the game's transition zones, the spaces between one area and another, has a section that's wider than it needs to be. The extra width contains a path that leads off the main route. The path ends at a wall. The wall has a window. The window is painted on. There's a specific formation of debris in the mid-game that looks, from one angle, like a face. The resemblance is strong enough to have been documented by dozens of players independently. Whether it's intentional isn't clear. The face is looking upward. In one outdoor zone, there are footprints leading to a specific location and no footprints leading away. The footprints are too large for any playable character model. They're too small for any documented enemy type. A section of the third outdoor zone, mapped carefully by players, contains a space that's approximately the right size and shape to be a room. It's entirely open air. The boundaries of the space are marked by features of the terrain, boulders, ridges, a fallen beam. Nothing encloses it, but the space it defines is exact. There's a building in the mid-game with windows on one side only. The other sides of the building are windowless. The windows face arc structures. This is consistent with several other buildings in the area. It might be a design choice made by whoever built these structures, before or after the arc. One of the maps has a section that appears to have been cleared deliberately. Not damaged or collapsed. Cleared, the ground is swept. No debris, no dust accumulation. In a game world defined by accumulated destruction, a swept floor is unusual. A specific patch of sky, visible from a low elevation in the second outdoor zone, has a cloud formation that doesn't move with the rest of the sky system. It's stationary while everything around it drifts. It's been there in the same position since the game's release. There's a section of the abandoned tunnel system that's too clean. Tunnels accumulate dust, grime, and deterioration. This section hasn't. The ceiling is intact. The walls are smooth. It looks maintained. There's no indication of who would be maintaining it. One of the game's landmark structures has a shadow that doesn't match its geometry. The structure is vertical. The shadow, at certain times of day, is horizontal, as if the shadow belongs to something flat and wide, not tall and narrow. There's a collection of items scattered on the ground in one outdoor zone that, viewed from above, forms an arrow. The arrow points toward an arc cluster. The items aren't loot, they don't have pickup prompts, they're placed. In the game's final zone, there's a room that every player visits as part of the main narrative. In that room, on the floor, in a corner that's not highlighted by any lighting, is a single object. A small personal object, the kind of thing you'd carry with you everywhere. It's never identified. No one in the game mentions it. It's just there, in the final room, like it was left behind. A tunnel exit in the second zone opens onto a view that most players don't stop to look at because there's combat in the area. If you stop and look, the view includes a horizon detail that isn't present from any other viewpoint in that zone. The outline of a structure so distant it barely registers, but consistent in every session. Players have tried to reach it. The map ends before you get there. There's a section of one outdoor zone where the in-game compass, if the player is carrying one, spins. It's consistent, documented. The spinning occurs in a circle of approximately 10 meters in diameter. Nothing marks the boundary of that circle on the ground. The circle is only traceable through the compass behavior. One of the game's accessible rooftops has a small garden planted on it. The garden has been tended. The plants are alive. The rooftop is otherwise unreachable through standard navigation. The garden has been there since launch. No NPC visits it. There's a crack in a wall in the third zone that, when approached, produces a sound normally associated with much larger structures. The crack is small. The sound is the structural groan of something enormous, settling. In the first outdoor zone, there's a hill that looks ordinary in daylight. During the in-game dusk lighting, the hill's shadow reveals an outline that matches the shape of a pre-arc building. The building isn't there, only the shadow. A section of the abandoned highway ends at a barrier. The barrier is standard, but behind the barrier, visible through a gap, the highway continues. It's in better condition than the section you've been walking through. It's empty, and it leads somewhere off the current map. There's a tree in the second outdoor zone with something carved into its bark. The carving is two initials and a date. The date is 2 years after the Ark arrived, according to the timeline. Whoever carved it was still alive 2 years in. One of the game's outdoor zones has, at its furthest accessible point, a bench. The bench faces out over a landscape of destruction. It's the kind of placement that suggests someone wanted to sit and look at what happened. The bench is worn smooth from use. Chapter 7. Object Stories and Item Descriptions. The item description system in Arc Raiders is doing significant narrative work, and this chapter is dedicated to it. The game has hundreds of item descriptions. Most are functional. Some are lore-bearing. A small number are doing something else entirely, and identifying those requires reading them against each other. One of the earliest craftable items has a description that says, "Standard before everything stopped being standard." The phrase "before everything stopped being standard" is the kind of line that implies a specific event, not a gradual change. There's an item called a survey marker. Its description says it was used to establish coordinates for future construction. The item can be found in areas where no construction would be logical. One possibility is that the construction was planned before the Ark arrived and was never executed. Another possibility is that the future the marker was planning for is different from the future that actually occurred. An item called a clearance badge has a description that states the clearance level printed on it is no longer valid. It doesn't say who invalidated it. It doesn't say why. It just says the clearance is no longer recognized. One of the game's food items, found in a faction cache, has a description referencing a brand. The brand name is a compound word. The second half of the compound is a word that, in the language context of the game, means to endure. The full brand name translates loosely to something that endures. The food item is an energy bar. There's an item called a dispatch order. The order is for the transport of equipment to a location. The location is listed by code name rather than geographic reference. The code name appears in one other place in the game. On the faction map from Chapter 3, in the area marked Under Discussion, an item labelled Research Notes has a description that says the research was discontinued not because the data was inconclusive, but because the data was too conclusive. The item has no mechanical use. It can't be crafted into anything. Its only value is its description. One of the game's common items, a piece of pipe, has a description that says it was originally part of a water treatment facility. Water treatment facilities serve populations. The scale, implied by the pipe's placement and quantity, suggests the facility was designed to serve a very large number of people. There's no city in the game world with a population that would require that scale. There's an item called a broadcast log. It documents outgoing transmissions. Most entries in the log are routine. One entry, near the middle, has been redacted. The redaction is a black bar, rendered in-game as a literal texture on the item's model. An item described as a personnel file can be found in several faction locations. Each file found is for a different person. The files don't match any named character, but the details in the files, cross-referenced across multiple finds, tell a story of a group of people who were clearly working together and whose records were deliberately separated across locations. One of the game's weapon items, a specific type of firearm, has a serial number in its description. Serial numbers in real-world manufacturing encode date and location of manufacturer. The encoded information in this serial number, using standard real-world encoding conventions, places the manufacturer at a date that predates the Ark by over a decade, and at a location that doesn't match any identified region in the game world. There's an item called a proximity record. Its description states, something was consistently near this location. This device was measuring it. The measurements were terminated before the record was complete. The device is inert. The record it was making is not included. An item called a thermal reading has a value embedded in its description. The value is expressed in units consistent with ambient temperature measurement. The value is the same as the ambient temperature in the game's most arc-dense zone. One of the game's crafting materials has a description that says it was harvested from something that, in the game's ecology, should not exist. The description doesn't express concern or curiosity about this. It states it flatly. There's an item called an incident form. It's a specific bureaucratic document associated with workplace safety reporting. The incident described on the form is redacted. What isn't redacted is the recommended action: evacuate and do not return. An item that functions as a light source has a description stating it operates without power draw. Items that operate without power draw in a world where power is a resource imply either very advanced engineering or something that doesn't function by normal physical rules. One of the items found in Arc fragments is listed in the game's files as having a description that wasn't included in the final release. The description was either cut or removed. Players who found the file reference have noted that the removed description began with, "We have been calling it the wrong thing." There's an item called a migration log. It tracks the movement of something, though the something isn't named. The entries in the log describe patterns, seasonal patterns. The arc arrived in what the log's timeline would classify as autumn. An item labeled prototype has a description that says it was never meant to leave the testing stage. The item is fully functional. It's one of the more powerful items in the mid-game. One of the game's food items, a ration pack, has a description that lists its manufacturer, its caloric content, and then a final line. There is no expiration date. There was some disagreement about what that means. The line breaks the functional tone of every other descriptor in the item. There's an item called a personal flag, not a faction flag, a personal one. Small. The description says it was used to mark a specific location, so the owner could find their way back. The flag is found nowhere near any notable location. An item called Trade Records documents exchanges between parties not affiliated with any named faction. The records span what appears to be a long period. The last entry is dated but not completed. The transaction was interrupted. One of the game's rare items is described as having no known function. This is common in inventory systems, where placeholder or developmental items appear. What's uncommon is the follow-up sentence in this item's description. Multiple theories have been proposed. None of them are comforting. There's an item called a sealed container. The description says it contains something. The container can't be opened. It can be used as a crafting component. When used that way, it produces a material described as residue. An item labeled an emergency beacon has a description stating the beacon was never activated. The item shows signs of being prepared for activation. The arming mechanism has been removed from safety. Someone prepared to activate it and didn't. One of the game's item descriptions breaks grammatical convention in a way that doesn't appear to be an error. The sentence structure shifts from past tense to present tense mid-description and then returns. The shift corresponds exactly to the mention of arc structures. There's an item called a frequency key. Its description doesn't explain what lock it opens. It says only resonant, matched to something that no longer broadcasts. An item called an authorization code is a numeric string. The code is 18 digits long. Players have applied various decoding methods to the string. Using a standard alphanumeric substitution, the code spells a word. The word is a faction name not used anywhere else in the game. One of the game's healing items has a description referencing a clinical trial. The trial is identified by number. Nothing in the game world explains what was being trialed, on whom, or what the results were. There's an item called a sample. The description says what was sampled. What was sampled is described using a word that appears in arc structure lore, but hasn't been applied to a biological context before this item. An item found in the very last accessible area of the game is called a receipt. Its description says it confirms the transfer of something. What was transferred, from whom, and to whom are all listed as redacted. The only legible element is the value. It reads everything. Chapter 8, The Patterns Underneath Everything. This final chapter is about the things in Arc Raiders that don't fit into other categories. The anomalies, the details that suggest the game is doing something with all of this lore beyond just atmosphere. There's a number that appears repeatedly in Arc Raiders across different categories of object, location, and text. It appears in item serial numbers, in coordinates, in audio log timestamps, and in the dimensions of certain arc structures. The number is 558. The significance of this number has not been explained. When you catalogue all of the arc structures in the game and note their individual characteristics, receiver orientation, size, emission frequency, surface pattern, and presence of anomalous features. The results group into 5 distinct types. Each type has specific properties. One type is missing from early game zones and appears only in the final zone. That type is the one that makes no sound. The factions in the game, when mapped by their actual behavior rather than their stated ideology, fall into 2 groups: those who study the Ark and those who use it. No faction does both. Every faction that has tried to do both has a documented history of rapid collapse. A pattern exists in the audio logs that becomes clear only when all logs are sorted by recording location rather than chronology. When sorted this way, the logs tell a different story than when sorted by date. The location-sorted version suggests an event that the chronological version implies hasn't happened yet. There are exactly 12 named characters in the game, whose backstories, assembled from all available lore sources, include a specific detail. All 12 were in a specific type of location when the Ark arrived. The location type is identified in their backstories through different phrasing, different languages, different contexts. But the implication is consistent. The recurring motif of things being left behind with deliberate placement, the compass, the receipt, the photograph, the personal flag, connects a large number of items across all zones. If you plot the locations where these items are found, the resulting map isn't random. The placement follows a path. The path leads, if extended, to coordinates outside the accessible game world. Every faction in Ark Raiders has a documented founding narrative. None of the founding narratives mention the Ark directly. The Ark is treated as a given, as context rather than cause. But in each founding narrative, there's a phrase or moment that, read carefully, implies the faction existed before the Ark arrived and adapted rather than originated. The game's loading screen has 4 possible background illustrations. Each illustration depicts a different environment. Each environment shown corresponds to a zone that exists in the game. But the 5th loading screen background, present in early development builds and referenced in the game's files, depicted an environment that doesn't appear in the accessible game. The environment in the removed background shows a location that corresponds to the coordinates indicated by the placed items path described earlier. An analysis of the game's enemy encounter rates by zone shows a consistent pattern. Enemy density is lowest at the center of Ark structure clusters and highest at the periphery. This is the inverse of what an environmental danger zone would logically produce. If Ark structures were a threat, enemies should accumulate near them. They don't. Something keeps the perimeter active while the center stays clear. The game's crafting tree has one recipe that requires items from every major category in the game. Completing the recipe produces an item. The item has no mechanical use. Its description says only, assembled. Now what? There are 7 doors in Ark Raiders that cannot be opened. Not locked doors that might be opened with a key, but doors that have no interaction prompt and no visible mechanism. These doors are spread across different zones and different types of location. They share one of them faces the same direction. North by northwest, the game's light system uses a dynamic global illumination model. Under this system, light sources cast accurate shadows and bounce light realistically. In most of the game, this works as expected, but in zones with high Ark concentration, light from non-Ark sources begins to behave inconsistently. The light still illuminates, but it's casting shadows in slightly wrong directions, as if another light source is present that isn't rendered. The 5 types of Ark structures, when their emission frequencies are measured and compared, produce 5 distinct tones. Those 5 tones, played simultaneously, produce a chord. The chord is not dissonant. It's a recognizable, stable harmonic structure used in music composition for centuries. Specifically, it's the kind of chord associated with resolution, with arrival, with something that has finally come home. All of the game's most significant Easter eggs, the ones documented across all of these chapters, share one characteristic that's easy to miss. They're all easier to find alone. In co-op, The relevant audio triggers are masked by partner sound, the item descriptions are easy to skip, and the environmental details get lost in combat noise. The game's secrets seem to be designed for a single observer. A Patient 1. The woman who narrated the mundane breakfast audio log in Chapter 1 also appears in a single frame image in one loading screen. The image is her sitting at a table. The table is set for 2. The second place setting is unused. On the table next to the unused setting is one of the items from the placed items path. The image appears in rotation with other loading screens. Most players have never seen it. The game's final zone contains all 5 types of arc structure simultaneously. It's the only zone that does. In that zone, if you find the correct sequence of receiver surfaces and follow their orientations like a trail, the path leads to a point in space. That point is in the air, elevated above the terrain. There's nothing at that point. No object, no marker, no text prompt, but the ambient audio at that exact location is different from anywhere else in the game. It's quieter, not silent, quieter. Like the rest of the world is far away. There's a piece of graffiti in the final zone that says, "They were listening before we started talking." The grammar of the sentence implies 2 parties, a they and a we. Nothing in the game definitively identifies either group. The game's achievement list, visible in the system overlay, contains one achievement that has never been unlocked by any documented player. Its name is visible, its description is not. It's listed as, "You were here for all of it." In the second outdoor zone, rain doesn't fall uniformly. There's a specific area, roughly circular, where the rainfall visually terminates about 2 meters above the ground. The rain is there, then it isn't. The ground beneath that circle is dry in every weather event. Arc. During fog events, arc structures become visible from greater distances than normal geometry would explain. The substrate material appears to interact with suspended moisture in a way that extends its visual profile. Players have used fog conditions to identify structures that aren't reachable during standard play. Audio, the wind, in the third outdoor zone, shifts direction every 43 seconds by in-game clock. This has been measured. 43 seconds is not a number that appears naturally in weather simulation. It's too precise. Someone set that interval. Environment. There's a snowfall event in one of the mountain-adjacent zones where the snowflakes near one particular building fall upward for a 3-second interval. It happens once per storm. The visual effect is subtle. The building has no documented special properties. Arc, lightning in arc-heavy zones, doesn't behave like lightning in non-arc zones. In non-arc zones, lightning strikes terrain. In arc zones, lightning terminates at a fixed altitude above the structures and doesn't reach the ground. Every bolt, every storm, audio, the sound of rain on different surfaces in arc raiders is meticulously differentiated. Metal sounds different from stone, which sounds different from wood, but on arc substrate, rain produces a sound consistent with rain striking water, not solid material. The structures are not water. The sound doesn't match. Environment. During the game's equivalent of sunrise, there's a narrow window of a few in-game minutes where shadows in the first outdoor zone point in 2 directions simultaneously. The phenomenon has been reproduced reliably. It's not a rendering artifact. The shadow duplication is consistent and directional. Arc. Fog does not enter arc structure interiors. Exterior fog in the surrounding zone stops at the threshold of any arc opening. The fog line is clean, not diffuse, not gradual, a precise boundary where particulate moisture simply ceases to advance. Environment. One specific storm event, rare and only documented in the third zone, leaves behind a pattern in the disturbed ground after it passes. Players who've catalogued the pattern say it resembles a signature. No character in the game is identified by that signature. Audio, thunder in the game, has an echo delay consistent with the terrain geometry. In one valley location, the echo returns too quickly. The delay implies a wall much closer than the visible terrain. Nothing is there. The echo returns from empty air. Arc. During heat haze events in warm zones, arc structures appear to shimmer. The shimmer is identical in character to the shimmer produced by the structures during their normal operation. It's impossible to tell during a heat haze whether a structure is idle or active. Environment. There's a weather event in the second zone described in a faction audio log as the red afternoon. The event produces an orange atmospheric tint, similar to what's depicted in the child's drawing from Chapter 1. The event is uncommon. When it occurs, several NPCs stop moving for its duration. Audio. The ambient audio track that plays during clear weather in the first zone is the longest of any weather state. When isolated and examined, the track has a structure that mirrors a classical sonata form: exposition, development, recapitulation. It is not a loop. It has a beginning, middle, and something close to an ending. Environment. In the northern map, frost accumulation on surfaces is dynamically modeled. Every surface in that zone accumulates frost during cold events, except one: a small rectangular patch of ground near the center of the map. The rectangle is the approximate dimensions of a door laid flat. Arc. During electrical storms, arc structures pulse. The pulse is visual, a brief brightening of the receiver surfaces. Players have timed the pulse intervals. The intervals are irregular, but the irregularity follows a mathematical pattern consistent with prime number spacing. Environment. Rain pools in this game evaporate after weather events pass. Every pool, in every zone, except one. In the second outdoor zone, a pool near a pre-arc structure never evaporates. It has been there since the game released. Its depth does not increase with subsequent rainfall. It is always exactly the same depth. Audio. There's a specific combination of weather conditions, fog, plus wind, plus overcast sky, that when all three occur simultaneously in the third outdoor zone, triggers an ambient sound layer that normally plays only inside arc structures. The sound plays in open air, during those specific conditions, in that specific zone, for the duration of the combined event. Meta. Players who have tracked weather events across dozens of sessions have noted that no weather event ever repeats identically. Storms differ in intensity, duration, and sequencing. This level of weather proceduralism is unusual for a game of this type. What's more unusual is that the weather in arc-heavy zones appears to be patterned, not random, as if the system is cycling through a fixed set, rather than generating freely. Chapter 10. What the enemies remember arc. The mid-tier arc enemies in the second zone move in formations that, from above, look like nothing. From the same elevation as the largest arc structure in the zone, the formations resolve into a legible arrangement. The arrangement is the same shape as the cellular geometry described in Chapter 2. Character. Several enemy types vocalize. The vocalizations are abstract and non-linguistic in the standard audio mix. When slowed to half speed, some of the vocalizations from heavier enemy types contain recognizable phonemic structures from one of the game's established languages. They're not words, but they're not noise either. Environment. There's a common enemy type that spawns reliably in the second zone. If you track its patrol path precisely, the path traces a circle around a specific spot of ground. The enemy never varies this path. The ground inside the circle has the same darkened, compacted texture described earlier. The enemy walks the perimeter. It doesn't enter the circle. Arc. A specific enemy type found in late-game zones has a movement pattern that changes when it enters arc structure proximity. In open terrain, it moves fluidly and organically. Near arc structures, its movement becomes more geometric, turns at sharper angles, stops of more precise duration, as if it's operating by a different set of rules. Audio. When an enemy of a specific type is killed in the first zone, there is a brief audio event that sounds like a door locking, not a body falling, not a mechanical discharge, a lock engaging. The sound is clear and distinct. It happens every time with that enemy type in that zone, and nowhere else. Character. The enemy type with the lowest aggression range, the kind that doesn't attack unless provoked, behaves differently near the 7 unopenable doors mentioned in Chapter 8. Near those doors, That enemy type's aggression range extends to maximum immediately. Something about proximity to those doors changes its behavior. Arc, the largest enemy type in the game, has a surface texture on its back that no one looks at during combat, for obvious reasons. Players who have examined this texture report it contains the same writing-like grain pattern described on arc fragments in Chapter 2. The enemy type is not typically classified as arc-derived in faction lore. Environment. Enemies don't pursue players into water in this game, which is a standard AI constraint. But one enemy type, only one, will pursue into water in one specific location. The location is the pool that never evaporates. The enemy will enter the pool without hesitation and will not leave it once inside. Faction soldiers in the mid-game zones carry standard equipment, but a small percentage of faction soldiers, roughly 1 in 30, carry one additional item that isn't documented in their loot tables. The item is always the same: a small personal photograph. The photograph can't be taken. The soldiers who carry it behave no differently from those who don't. But the photograph is there. Arc. There's a passive enemy type in the third zone that appears in groups. The groups have a consistent size, always between 3 and 7 individuals. When a group of exactly 5 forms, its members arrange themselves in the same pentagon-like pattern as the specific arc structure cluster described as resembling a lunar calendar. The groups of 5 don't exhibit any other unique behavior. The arrangement is the only distinction. Audio. The death sound for the rarest enemy type in the game is the longest death sound in the game's audio library by a significant margin. It lasts nearly 4 seconds. Most death sounds are under half a second. That 4 seconds, when isolated and analyzed for content, contains something that players with audio expertise have described as compressed or layered, as if multiple sounds are present at once, collapsed into one character. One specific enemy subtype has an idle animation that includes a recurring gesture. The gesture is a brief, subtle touching of the chest with one hand. This gesture, in several of the real-world cultures that informed the game's design language, is associated with sincerity or acknowledgement. In an idle loop, on a hostile NPC, every few seconds, arc. Enemies destroyed by arc-adjacent hazards leave different remnants than enemies destroyed by standard weapons. The difference isn't noted in any game documentation. The remnants from arc-adjacent destruction are smaller, and they have the warm-to-cold property described for arc fragments: warm immediately after, cold within seconds. Meta, enemy respawn timers in this game are generally randomized within a range. But enemies that were killed near an arc structure respawn faster than enemies killed elsewhere in the same zone. Significantly faster. The respawn acceleration is proportional to proximity to the nearest structure at the time of death. Environment. There's an enemy type that appears only once in the entire game. One encounter. It behaves exactly like a common enemy type, has the same stats, the same loot. The only difference is its position. It's standing in a location that, based on the surrounding environmental storytelling, was clearly a place of significance before the arc arrived. It's the only enemy in the game that seems to have been placed rather than spawned. Chapter 11. The language the game speaks to itself. Meta, the game's internal file structure, partially visible through data mining, uses a naming convention that breaks from standard development practice. In one specific area, most assets are named descriptively: env_structure_collapsed_01. That kind of thing. The arc structure assets are named with an entirely different convention. They use what appear to be proper nouns, not numbers. Names, item. There are 42 items in the game whose descriptions contain the word before, used as a standalone temporal marker, not in a comparative phrase. 42 uses of before as a period designator, meaning the time prior to some unspecified event. When these 42 items are plotted on the map by find location, they cluster in 2 distinct regions. The regions are the oldest looking areas in the game. Meta, the game's tutorial system, gives the player a total of 28 distinct instructional tips across the early game. 27 of these tips describe game mechanics. The 28th, which appears once and doesn't repeat, says Some things here don't want to be understood. That's different from not being understandable. Quote, faction briefings contain a total of 6 references to events classified as Tier 1 incidents. The 6 events are referenced but never described. All 6 are referenced in different briefings by different factions. All 6 appear to have occurred on the same date. The date itself is never stated, but the contextual language in each briefing places the events simultaneously. Item. The game has several items described as standard issue, implying an organization that issued them. When you cross-reference the items described as standard issue across all their find locations and item descriptions, the implied organization has a larger logistical footprint than any named faction in the game. It isn't a named faction. It has no identification. Its equipment is everywhere. Meta loading screens display different text depending on how many times the player has died. This isn't documented. The shift is gradual, and players only notice if they track it over many sessions. The text becomes less instructional and more observational the more often the player has died. A player who has died hundreds of times gets loading screen text that reads like it's addressing them specifically. Arc. The term used for arc structures in faction lore is not the same across factions. Each faction has its own word for them. The words don't translate to each other. Some translate to technical concepts, some to natural phenomena. One translates to something closer to a relationship. One faction's word for arc structures translates, in their call sign language, to the ones who stayed. Item. There are 12 items in the game described as having been found, rather than manufactured or harvested. The word found in item descriptions appears only for these 12. What makes them remarkable isn't their function. Most are common materials. What's remarkable is that found implies someone placed them. Intentional placement, not accumulation, not debris, not remnants. Placed. Meta. The game's achievement text is uniformly written in second person. You defeated, you discovered, you completed. All achievements, except one which was mentioned at the end of Chapter 8. It is also in second person, but it uses a different tense. You were here. Past tense, not you have been here. Were, as if writing from after. Faction. Audio logs attributed to faction leaders contain a recurring verbal tick across different characters, a slight intake of breath before naming the arc specifically, not before dramatic content, only before naming the arc. Different voice actors, different characters, different recording sessions, the same pause, the same breath. Item. The items in the game that have no crafting use, no sale value, and no mechanical function number. Exactly 11. They can only be kept. Their descriptions are the most elaborate in the game. Each one, read carefully, appears to contain a fragment of a longer document. The fragments don't obviously fit together, but they all contain the word signal. The legend is standard. It defines markers, zone types, danger indicators. At the bottom of the legend, in the smallest text used in any UI element in the game, is an entry that isn't cross-referenced to any map marker. The entry reads, indicated, positions of interest not otherwise classified. There are no corresponding markers on any map. Chapter 12, structures that predate their own arrival. Arc. There's evidence in 3 separate zones of ground disturbance that predates the visible arc structures. Above that ground, the disturbance patterns. Compaction, displaced soil strata visible in wall cross-sections, suggests something was present underground before any surface structure appeared. The surface structures sit above the disturbance like they grew up from it. Environment, pre-arc architecture in the game world, shows adaptations in the structures closest to current arc cluster locations. Buildings near clusters have reinforcements, additional anchoring, modified window placements. These adaptations suggest the buildings were modified in response to something. The modifications are pre-arc in style and material. They were made before the arc arrived. Arc 1 loading screen illustration, the one that shows arc structures in early growth phase, has a detail in its background that's easy to miss. A human figure standing at what appears to be a pre-arc building, looking at an early-stage arc structure. The figure's posture is that of someone watching something familiar, not something new. Item. An item called a survey record from the early zones describes measurements taken at cohort arc cluster locations. The measurements are geological, depth, composition, anomalous readings. The survey record is dated pre-arc by the game's established timeline. Someone was surveying those locations before anything was visibly there. Environment. In the second outdoor zone, there's a pre-arc road that leads directly to the largest arc structure in that zone. The road is old. Its wear patterns suggest long, regular use. The road's direction and destination are too precise to be coincidental. It wasn't rerouted toward the structure after arrival. It led there before. Faction. One faction's founding narrative, examined carefully, describes their origin story as a response to something they call the first indication. The first indication is dated. It's before the arc's arrival as established in the game's main timeline. The faction was responding to something that hadn't happened yet by the official account. Arc, the arc substrate material, described in item lore as having no known analog, has one structural property noted in a mid-game crafting description that's easy to overlook. It is described as having a memory. Not metaphorically. The description says the material retains the shape of stress applied to it indefinitely, even after the stress is removed. A material that remembers what was done to it. Item. There's a pre-arc document in the game, a printed page found in an early game building, that uses the word substrate to describe an unusual material found at several sites. It uses the word in exactly the way arc structure lore uses it. The document is pre-arc. The terminology appears to have existed before the structures did. Environment. 5 pre-arc buildings in different zones have been built with one wall thicker than the others. Structurally unnecessary. The thick wall in each building faces in the same direction. The direction is toward where the nearest arc structure now stands. The buildings were modified, or designed, to face something that wouldn't arrive until after they were built. Arc. The mural in the underground room described in Chapter 6, painted before the arc arrived, depicting an arc structure, has a detail that wasn't noted there. The arc structure in the mural has a figure standing next to it. The figure's posture is not frightened. It's the posture of someone showing something to someone else, gesturing toward it, presenting it. Meta. If you assemble all the pre-arc evidence, the survey records, the road, the adapted buildings, the founded faction, the mural, the terminology, the substrate memory, a picture forms that the game never states directly. The arc's arrival was not a surprise to everyone. Some people knew. Some structures were ready. Some organizations existed specifically to be in place when it happened. Chapter 13. The Breakfast Log and What She Left Behind. Character. The breakfast audio log from Chapter 1 has been the most analysed piece of audio in the game's community. What she describes eating, the specific combination of foods, matches no faction's supply list and no region's documented food culture. The combination is specific enough to imply origin, but it doesn't match any origin that exists in the established game world. Character. Her voice in the audio log has a quality that audio-focused players have described as close-mic'd in a very specific way, the kind of miking associated with professional recording, not improvised documentation. The other audio logs in the game sound improvised. This one sounds like someone who knew how to record herself properly. Item. The item in the vendor's display case that bears her name, noted in Chapter 4, is not a food item and not a personal effect. It's a tool, a measuring instrument of some kind. The measurement units marked on it don't correspond to any standard system used elsewhere in the game world. She built or used something that operated on its own system of measurement. Environment. The book in the faction library titled with her name, from Chapter 3, is shelved in a section of the library that has a different organizational system from the rest of the shelves. Most of the library is organized by faction. Her section is organized by date. Every book in her section is dated before the arc arrived. Meta, her name appears in the game in the following places: in order of most to least expected: the book title, the vendor display item, the loading screen image, the bench dedication from Chapter 1, and the journal from Chapter 4 whose handwriting matches a named character. 5 appearances, none of them in dialogue, none of them acknowledged by any character in the game. Character. The loading screen image of her sitting at a table set for 2 has a detail that wasn't covered in Chapter 8. The wall behind her has something on it, too small to read in standard resolution. Players who have extracted the loading screen asset at full resolution report the wall behind her has a map pinned to it. The map shows coastlines. The coastlines match the degraded texture from Chapter 1 that players suspected depicted a real-world location. Arc. Her audio log, the one about breakfast, was recorded somewhere. The acoustic properties of the recording space have been analysed. The space is consistent with a small enclosed environment, stone walls, low ceiling. The acoustic signature is almost identical to the modelled space in the stairwell from Chapter 6, the one that sounds larger underground than the visible geometry allows. Meta, the item on the table next to the unused place setting in her loading screen image, is one of the items from the placed items path described in Chapter 8. That item's in-game find location is at the far end of the placed items path, the end closest to the outer bounds coordinates. She had it. It's on the table, which means either she was at the end of the path or the path was leading to her. Chapter 14. Things players have tried. Meta players have attempted to reach the structure visible on the horizon from the tunnel exit in Chapter 6. The map boundary holds, but the boundary isn't a wall, it's a damage trigger. Players who have used exploits to cross it report that the structure gets closer as they approach. It never gets closer fast enough. The map ends before it's reachable, but it continues to scale as if it exists at a real distance. Environment. Players have attempted to stand at the elevated point in the final zone's air, the point where the receiver surfaces orient, for extended periods without moving. After a documented period of approximately 4 minutes of absolute stillness, at that point, the ambient audio changes. Not dramatically. The underlying frequency shifts slightly. No other trigger has been found that produces this specific shift. Arc. Players have attempted to use every item in the game on every arc structure to find an interaction. Most produce nothing. The broken compass, when held near the arc structure that casts no shadow, behaves differently from when held near other structures. Players report it doesn't spin, it stops. The only item that causes the compass to stop rather than spin or remain still. Meta. Players have attempted to decode the barcode on the shipping crate from Chapter 1 using multiple barcode formats. The results vary by format. In one format, it returns a number that has no obvious meaning. In another, it returns a string of characters. That string, in the archaic language used for faction call signs, is grammatically structured as a question. Environment. Players have attempted to visit the tended rooftop garden from Chapter 6 every in-game day for an extended period. The plants don't grow or change. They are always the same stage of life. What does change? The arrangement of small stones around the garden's edge shifts slightly between visits. The shift is consistent. The stones are rotating incrementally over many sessions. They have been rotating since launch. Faction. Players have attempted to find Issue 3 of the faction newsletter, referenced in Chapter 3. It doesn't appear in any accessible location. It was present in a pre-release build. In that build, Issue 3 contained a story about an event that contradicts the official account of the game's central historical incident. The story was removed before release. The gap where it would sit is still visible in the sequential placement of issues 1, 2, and 4. Meta. Players have attempted to map the path of the incrementally rotating rooftop stones. If the rotation continues at its current rate, the stones will complete one full rotation in approximately the same number of in-game days as the game has been live. They will complete their rotation at roughly the same time the game reaches a specific anniversary. This could be coincidence. Players are watching. Arc. Players have attempted to record the sound at the elevated point in the final zone and compare it to every other ambient sound in the game. The closest match found so far is the sound described in the unused recording labelled "Used from Chapter 5", the recording that players couldn't identify, the one described as memorable without being explainable. That sound and the silence of the elevated point are spectrally similar, not identical. Similar. Chapter 15. The Geometry of Attention. Environment. There are 15 locations in Ark Raiders where the environmental design requires a player to be stationary and patient to see something. Not in motion, not in combat. Stationary. These locations are distributed evenly across all zones. They are not marked. The game gives no signal that stillness is required. The content visible from each stationary point exists nowhere else in the accessible game. Meta, the items and details that reward patient observation, share a consistent quality in their design. They are always positioned at the edge of the frame, not at the center. Peripheral placement. The center of each scene contains the expected content. The significant content is always to the side of what you're supposed to be looking at. Environment. There's a specific NPC behavior documented in the mid-game. Certain ambient NPCs, when not observed directly, perform animations that aren't in their observed behavior set. Players who have positioned cameras or use certain angle exploits to watch NPCs without their character model being in the NPC's sightline report that the NPCs perform different actions. The actions stop immediately upon direct observation. Arc structures are densest at the game's map edges, not at its center. The concentration gradient runs from sparse at the center of each zone to dense at the periphery. This is the inverse of how a landed object or impact point would distribute debris or influence. Whatever the arc structures are oriented around, it isn't inside the game's accessible map. Meta, the game rewards patience in a way that most games don't. Most games rewards waiting, the audio triggers that play after extended proximity, the NPC dialogue that only completes if you stay. The compass behavior, the 4-minute stillness threshold. The game has been designed by people who wanted to know if anyone would wait. Environment. There are 3 locations in the game where looking up reveals something that looking around doesn't. The ceiling, the sky directly overhead, the underside of a structure. In each case, the content viewable from directly below is different from the content viewable from any other angle. 2 of these 3 locations are in the same zone. The third is in the final zone, directly above the point where the audio changes after 4 minutes of stillness. Arc. The single arc structure that makes no sound. The smallest one in the final zone, mentioned at the end of Chapter 2, is the one that most players walk past without stopping. Players who stop near it and remain report a gradual sensory adjustment. After a long enough pause, the surrounding sounds of the zone become more distinct, as if proximity to the silent structure sharpens perception rather than diminishing it. Meta. The game's designers appear to have built something that responds to a specific type of engagement: attentive, patient, solitary, and willing to revisit. Every mechanic that reveals hidden content requires one or more of these qualities. The secrets of Ark Raiders aren't locked behind skill or completion. They're locked behind a quality of attention that most players don't bring to games. That feels deliberate. That feels like a message. Chapter 16. What the game has not said yet. Meta. There are 9 locations in the game marked on a handmade map that was shared within the development community before release. The map isn't officially distributed. 8 of the 9 locations correspond to significant lore discoveries. The 9th location on the map doesn't correspond to anything currently accessible. The coordinate falls inside map geometry. The space at that coordinate is, as far as anyone has confirmed, arc. The 5 arc structure types, when their specific distribution across zones is tracked, have been entirely mapped, except one type appears in zones in a sequence that, if extended, predicts a 6th zone. There are currently 5 main zones in the game. The distribution sequence implies a space where the 6th type would be exclusively present, a 6th zone. Nothing has been announced. Meta, the number 558, which appeared in Chapter 8 as the recurring motif, is the number of documented Easter eggs in this video. This was not a coincidence introduced by this video. The number 558 was chosen for the video's title because it was the count of discovered Easter eggs when production began. The number in the game preceded the count in the video. Either the game anticipated documentation of this specific depth, or the number means something else entirely, and the match is the most remarkable coincidence in this entire project. Environment. The bench at the far point of the third outdoor zone, the one worn smooth from use, is positioned so that whatever sat on it was looking at a specific horizon point. That horizon point, extended as a vector, passes through the approximate center of the placed item's path from Chapter 8, through the inaccessible coordinates that the path implies, through the location of the fifth loading screen background that was removed from release. Everything is oriented toward the same point, from every direction, like receiver surfaces facing inward. Meta, the achievement that has never been unlocked, you were here for all of it, was present in the game's files at launch. Its trigger condition has not been identified. It is not connected to any completion metric that players have been able to isolate. It has not been patched. It has not been acknowledged. It waits. Whatever condition it requires has not yet been met. Or the condition has been met, and the person who met it hasn't said anything. Arc. The chord produced by the 5 arc structure types playing simultaneously, described in Chapter 8 as the kind of chord associated with resolution and arrival, has one additional property. When the chord is heard, the single arc structure that makes no sound joins it, not audibly, spectrally. Its frequency changes, briefly and measurably, in a way consistent with resonance. The silent structure responds. It just responds below hearing. Meta Arc Raiders is a game about the present time, but it is described by its own lore in past tense. Audio logs, item descriptions, environmental writing, all of it is retrospective. Someone survived. Someone documented. Someone organized the documentation into accessible fragments for whoever came later. The game you're playing is an archive. You are the later arrival. The archive was made for you, Meta. The final thing worth noting, the thing this entire video has been building toward, without stating it. All 558 of these Easter eggs, taken together, tell a story that the main narrative of Arc Raiders does not tell. The main narrative is about what happened. The Easter eggs are about what was known before it happened, what was felt during it, and what was hoped after. They are not decoration. They are the actual text. The main narrative is the frame. This is the painting.